Good afternoon to all of you, and let me begin by saying that a few years ago we had in the House of Representatives a speaker by the name of John McCormick. John McCormick was a great debater, and every now and then he would want to leave the speaker's chair and, as we say, come onto the floor of the House and into the well. And in the course of the debate, someone on the other side of the aisle would invariably irritate him. And he'd turn to that person and say, "I hold the gentleman from Iowa in minimum high regard." I want you to know, because of your association with Illinois College, I hold each of you here today in maximum high regard. And it has been a very high privilege for me to visit this campus even for a few hours. Indeed, when I leave the positions that I now hold, President Stoyer, it may very well be I'll want to submit an application to become a student here. I'm not at all sure my grade point average would be high enough, but maybe you'd give me a break. I want to say also what a high pleasure it is for me to be with Paul Finley. I told a group a moment ago of the Phi Alpha Literary Society that one of these days I'm going to set up a Hall of Fame for public servants. We have them now for baseball players and guitar players. We ought to have them for public servants. And on the very first ballot, I would put into that Hall of Fame Paul Finley, because of his remarkable service in representing this congressional district, because of the kind of person he is. And my greatest recollection of Paul is always his insistence to try to find a solution to a problem in a very constructive way. And I want Paul to know how deeply I have appreciated his friendship, and Lucille, his wife, over a period of years. Now, I happened to notice 2 or 3 times here that people said I'd been in the Congress for 34 years. I'll tell you a story about that. I made a pretty bad mistake when I announced my retirement. I said that I'd been in the Congress for 34 years and I had cast over 16,000 votes. And I went back to my office. I had a telephone call, and a constituent said, "Lee, I understand you announced your retirement today." I said, "Yes." He said, "I understand you cast over 16,000 votes." I said, "Yes." He said, "I want you to know you finally made a decision I agree with." And that, of course, is why I like these nice introductions. I had a lot of fun in the United States Congress, and one of the things I did was keep track of various sayings that impressed me, and I want to repeat for you the all-time best bumper sticker. This does not quite rise to an academic level, but I'll tell it anyway. We had some years ago a Catholic priest in the House. His name was Father Robert Drinan. My understanding today is a Catholic priest cannot be elected to Congress, but he was then. And his bumper sticker was very simple. It said, "Vote for Father Drinan, or go to hell." I never had that kind of courage myself. And Paul Finley and I debated the Middle East practically every other week in the Congress, and maybe he remembers when one of the members got up and said, talking about the Middle East and all of the conflicts there, he said, "I don't see why the Arabs and the Israelis cannot settle this thing, just like good Christians ought to." And since we're in Lincoln country, I will say that one of the members got up one time and said if Abraham Lincoln were alive today, he'd be turning over in his grave. And during a debate on trade, another member got up. He got his metaphors mixed up a little bit, and he said, "If we don't stop shearing the sheep that lays the golden egg, we'll pump it dry." I was campaigning one day, and a fellow came up to me and he said, "Did anyone ever tell you you look like Lee Hamilton?" I was getting ready to respond, and I said, "Well, as a matter of fact, And the fellow said, doesn't that really piss you off? I guess it's appropriate for me to start something serious here. Let me begin with this observation, that after the next President of the United States walks down Pennsylvania Avenue after the inauguration, he or she will step into the Oval Office, and he or she will find new and profound challenges for the United States lurking around every corner. And if they do not already know, and I suspect they do, they will see a world that confronts them with very difficult, complex, and dangerous challenges. It's about as long a list of unfinished business as I can ever remember a president meeting when they step into that Oval Office. I don't think I need to go into a lot of detail here. You know the problems. Iraq. How do we get out of Iraq responsibly, meeting our obligations? Afghanistan, the present situation is very grim, to put it mildly. The prospect of failure is rising. Iran, we have a regime that we think at least is pursuing nuclear weapons. How do we enter into a dialogue with Iran today? One of the great challenges before us. In a few days, a new president will step into power in Russia. We're confronted with an altogether different situation there. Two men in charge. We don't really know at this point who's going to have the power. The country has been moving away from democracy, even as its confidence has been rising. Pakistan, where we are fearful that an Islamic radical group could get hold of the nuclear weapon, and then we would be confronted with the greatest of all horrors, the possibility of terrorists having that weapon. The problems of challenge force with radical Islam, 1.3 billion Muslims from London to Jakarta. They don't think very highly of you and me. We've seen the poll numbers. We don't rank as well as used car salesmen. And it's kind of hard, isn't it, for us to understand, because we think we're pretty good people, pretty decent people. The rise of China and India, nation building, humanitarian crises happening day after day, poverty, disease, development, globalization, the changing global economy, climate change, limited resources, nuclear weapons. The challenges go on. And of course, you have to put in that list of challenges the unknown, don't you? When Al Gore and George Bush debated about foreign policy in that 2000 election, the 9/11 Commission looked back and we found that there was only one mention by either one of the candidates in the entire campaign of the word terrorism. But terrorism came to dominate the presidency of George Bush. So the sheer number and complexity of these problems is bound to impress all Americans, and of course especially the new president. And so I think about the central realities confronting that president. Let me mention four of them. You may want to add to the list, you may want to subtract to it. Number one, I think most of us would agree upon, with some reservation perhaps now, but number one would be the preeminence of American power. I know some of the limitations of that power, but there isn't any doubt that America is preeminent today in power, in military terms, in economic terms, in cultural terms. And yet, while our ability to accomplish things around the globe is unparalleled, it's also limited. And Americans, I believe, are deeply unsettled about the role that America should play in the world today. The United States is dominant, but we have learned, a bit to our distress, that we cannot solve all these problems by ourselves. The preeminence of American power. A second reality that I would mention is the shifting global alignments taking place. The world order today, I think, is as fluid as it has been at any time during my experience in these matters. China and India rapidly on the rise. You cannot sit down and have a discussion in Washington, D.C. today about foreign policy without somebody bringing up the word China. Sometimes I think we're fixated on it. But the rise of China is going to have a profound impact on every life in this room and how we relate to that rise. India likewise. Two countries, huge populations, fast-growing economies, advanced technologies, nuclear weapons, and remarkable political and military potential. The European Union is enlarged. Russia lurches between democracy and authoritarianism, engagement and estrangement. New powers in regions like Brazil and Indonesia. These changes are transforming the landscape of the international scene with a shift towards Asia and towards more centers of global power. And the third central reality may be the mega trend, and that's the one we know as by the word globalization, the interconnectedness, the interdependence. I stepped out of a hotel a few years ago in Louisville, Kentucky, and picked up a newspaper, and my eye fell on about a 3-sentence story down at the bottom of a business page for some reason, and it said that the currency in Thailand was unstable. And I said to myself, well, no big deal. No sweat off my back. Why should I worry about that? And a week later, I saw that the Indonesia stock market had some problems. And a week after that, the Japanese. And about a month later, the New York Stock Exchange collapsed. Interdependence, interconnectedness. Now, the problem with globalization is that it's not global. There are winners and there are losers. If you listen carefully to the Democratic candidates who are debating this question, they talk about trade all the time. But trade is really a kind of a catchword for globalization. And the American worker today, and the candidates have certainly picked this up, are uneasy, worried about the future and their jobs. And so the candidates speak to that problem through the symbol, if you would, of trade. And a fourth central reality is simply turmoil. Everywhere you look, economic, cultural, political convulsions caused by rapid change, weak governments, civil wars, epidemics, disease, environmental and population crises. I read about a month ago, small article, page 30, 40, big newspaper. 4 million citizens of Africa killed in the last 7 or 8 years. 4 million. I don't even remember hearing about it. I don't remember seeing anything on television about it. I don't remember any articles in the Washington Post or the New York Times. 4 million people die, and I, who follow international events reasonably closely, didn't know about it. 4 million people? What difference does it make? Why worry about them? Turmoil. Does that have consequences? You bet it has consequences. And we'll be learning about those consequences for years to come. Terrorism and the proliferation of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons may be the most urgent symbol of this turmoil. I worry about the erosion of the non-proliferation regime in the world. And when somebody asks me what should be the dominant concern of American foreign policy, it's an easy question for me. It's the possibility of nuclear weapons getting into bad hands. Not because it's the most likely, but because the consequences of it are beyond anything we can imagine. 3,000 people dead on 9/11. And just think a moment of all of the changes in your life and in this country with 3,000 dead. Let your mind play on what we said would be the result if a nuclear bomb went off in Manhattan. In our 9/11 Commission report, we said there would be 500,000 dead. We can't imagine that. We don't know what would happen in this country if we had that kind of an experience. And so I say, Mr. President, whoever you are, put this at the top of the list, because the consequences are so severe. And so we come to this year 2008, and we're not as secure, we're not as influential, we're not as dominant as we would like to be. And we've learned to our distress that a small group of people working in a country as remote from the United States as it's possible to be can cause death to many of our citizens, can cause the federal budget to explode on security matters. Okay. Advice to the next president. That's kind of presumptuous of me, isn't it? But like everybody, I've got some views on it. One of the things I want to say is that when the president steps into that office, there's a lot of good things happening in the world. And we ought to be grateful for that. There aren't any great power conflicts. When I was a young boy, and some of you older folks here have to point to the senior members of the faculty. The younger faculty members can't remember this, but we worried about the Soviet Union hitting the button and blowing us off the face of the earth, didn't we? I worried about it. I went to Congress, and one night I was putting my young daughter to bed, and she said, "Daddy, are those missiles from the Soviet Union really going to hit us in Washington?" She'd heard a speech I gave on the floor of the House. In South America, Eastern Europe, Asia, and elsewhere, democracy is the rule and not the exception. The global economy has entered its 5th straight year with over 4% growth. We're making some progress. All of the progress is fragile, but it's encouraging too. And I hope the president will note the good things that are happening. But he's going, or she's going, to have to make some very tough decisions with regard to priorities. I gave you that long list of things, and I could add to it at the beginning of my remarks. You can't solve all those problems. The most important decisions a president makes relates to priorities. Are you going to do this, or are you going to do that? You can't do it all. I've told you what my priority is on nuclear weapons, but I don't know what the new president's going to decide. But he or she will have a lot of tough decisions to make on priorities. Our next president will know that his or her, I have to be careful here, don't I? His and her leadership will be a key ingredient of American foreign policy. I walked into the office of the National Security Advisor a few years ago. There were a stock of files on the desk this high. I said, "What are those?" About 30 or 40 of them. The National Security Advisor said, "Those are all that need immediate attention, every file." There's another stack over on the other side of the desk. I said, "What about those?" And he said to me, "Those are all urgent." Now, we know about many of those problems because we read the newspapers and watch television, but we don't know a lot about them. But the fact of the matter is that in Washington, D.C., when you have all of these important people coming into town every single day, a treasury minister, a foreign minister, a prince, a king, a head of government, they come streaming into Washington day after day. I think there were 3 heads of state in Washington last week, plus the Pope. He's head of state also, isn't he? 4. Why do they all come? They come for one reason. They want help. Maybe they want aid, maybe they want trade, maybe they want military arms, maybe they want a picture op with the president, I don't know, but they come. Why? Because the United States can help them, because of our position in the world. And surely the next president is going to have to restore respect for America. We've seen a sharp decline in that respect in the past few years. In every poll I've seen, America's more disliked around the world than at any point in our history. I've been spending a lot of time on Iraq, and one of the things that really bothers me is, why do we have to bear all the cost? Don't the neighboring countries have some responsibility here? Why are they putting it all on us? We alone are coping with the costs, and of course, their answer is, well, you folks started it. Work it out. But that's not a satisfactory answer, because the whole world has a stake now in what happens in Iraq, and especially the countries in that region. You know, I know there are a lot of differences between the presidential candidates, but one of the things that has impressed me is how much they agree on some things. All 3 of them have said they're going to stop waterboarding and torture. All 3 of them have said they're no longer skeptics about global warming. They're going to support vigorous U.S. leadership on that question. All 3 of them have said we need comprehensive immigration reform and a path to legal status for those who entered the workforce illegal. All 3 of them. All of them have said they favor closing Guantanamo. All of them have said they're going to put more focus on Afghanistan. I know there are a lot of differences, but there are a lot of similarities as well. And they all understand that they're going to have to be sure that they act to restore respect for America. And if they take the steps I've just identified, they'll go a long way in that direction. I think the next president has to understand the urgent need for American leadership. I understand that a lot of Americans today are turning inward, don't want to fool with the problems around the world. I can appreciate that. I feel that way myself sometimes. But we can't do that. I'm aware of these sharp instincts for isolationism, as we used to call it. But the world needs our leadership. You see, I happen to believe that the United States, when it exercises its leadership, looking over a period of many years, it's a positive thing for the world. I don't want to overstate that. We make some mistakes. We can be arrogant. But overall, every president I've known really, genuinely tries to make the world a little better place. You and I may not always agree with their judgments, but I don't think we should disagree with their motivations. And the next president will not, of course, believe that the United States has entered into some kind of permanent decline. And I believe what Americans want is leadership on behalf of a world where our interests are protected, where we work with like-minded nations, where the values of liberty and justice and opportunity are the norm, not the exception, and where, if I may quote Martin Luther King, the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice. And I hope the next president understands that we need help. You go home tonight. Sit down and write on a tablet the problems you think are the worst problems we confront. I don't know what you'd put down. Maybe nuclear proliferation, maybe climate change, maybe drugs, maybe AIDS, maybe economic problems, war, turmoil, whatever you put down, and I'll tell you something. We, the United States, cannot solve a single one of them by ourselves. How are you going to solve the problem of immigration without talking to Mexico? How do you solve the problem of nuclear proliferation without talking to Iran and North Korea? We need help, no matter what we tackle. And you see, I think in the past, the success of American foreign policy has been that while we pursued our own national interest, the period after World War II is a good illustration, other nations benefited from our leadership. It wasn't us and them in dealing with the problem, it was we. We were all in it together. Collective security, we called it. And I believe the next President of the United States will have to be concerned about competence. Now, this may make some of you feel a little uneasy. But the world has noted Katrina and how we dealt with it. The world has noted Iraq and how we dealt with it. And when you look at the polls that show the United States does not stand very high in public esteem, if you look down to the third, fourth, fifth paragraphs, you'll see something else. Not only do they object to our policies, which we understand, but they wonder about our ability to carry our policies out. Competence. Secretary Gates gave a speech the other day. He was talking about the budget of the State Department. Secretary of Defense came out in support for an increase in the budget of the State Department. I've been around Washington a long time. I've never seen that happen before. Secretary Gates is exactly right, in my judgment. We have to improve our ability to perform, our capability. And that, among other things, of course, means that we engage in nation building. It's not just a question of going into a country and blowing it apart. It's a question of going in, increasing the stability of the country, and then trying to build it. And that takes all kinds of skills. And we've had a mixed record, to put it kindly, of success at all of that. So I think the next president has to strengthen the non-military tools of power. Look, I understand why Americans want to give the Defense Department so much money. I understand why we want to have the biggest, strongest, preeminent army in all the world. If you want a surefire applause line before any audience in America, talk about strengthening the armed forces. What I don't understand is why we don't supply enough resources to the non-military aspects of dealing with these problems. See, I'm of the school that believes in negotiation. I'm not starry-eyed about that. I know you can't solve every problem with negotiations. I know that diplomacy has to be backed by power. I know that you have to use all of the tools of American power and to succeed in the conduct of American policy, but I think you need robust diplomacy to explain our policies, to understand the views of others, to dispel misunderstandings, to build trust, to collect intelligence, to deter bad actions, to reduce the chance of inadvertent military escalation, and, of course, to reach agreement. How do you solve problems without talking to people? If you know, let me know, would you? I've never bought into this idea that when things get tough, you withdraw your ambassador. You ever heard of that? That's exactly the wrong thing to do. When things get tough, you need the diplomats there. I was in the Congress, Paul Finley was too, when we began talking with members of the Supreme Soviet in the Soviet Union. I'd get up and give a speech, read it. My counterpart from the Soviet Union would get up and read a speech. Then we'd toast each other with vodka. And we came out for peace in the world. And we came out for prosperity for our grandchildren. And then we'd pat each other on the back and go home. And we did it the next year, and the next year, and the next year. And we kept it up. All of the time, keep in mind, either nation could blow the other nation off the face of the earth. And then something happened. Something happened is that we put our speeches away and we began to talk to one another. We didn't solve all the problems quickly. We kept talking. We kept talking. We talked for 40 years. When Ronald Reagan went to Berlin and said, "Tear down this wall, Mr. Gorbachev," he sent an arms control negotiator to Moscow. And we kept talking. I don't know how you solve these problems. It's better to jaw than to war, said Winston Churchill. Truman, Eisenhower, Marshall, Atchison, those are the heroes for me in the era of, I think, unparalleled American diplomacy. Well, I guess I'd better wind up here. The president's getting a little nervous. Students want to get out of here and do other more important things than listen to me. I've got a lot of good material here. I'll just skip over a lot of it, I believe. I'll come back next year and finish it. I want to talk a little bit about values in American foreign policy, but I'll skip over that. How do we appeal to these? Someone asked me at lunch today, how do we appeal to the radical Islams in the world? It's not complicated. Let me tell you a story. It's a political story. Every politician who holds office that I know is asked to do something by a constituent almost on a weekly, if not a daily basis. The constituent will ask him or her, the representative, to do something that is utterly impossible to do. I don't know a single successful politician who says to that person, "I cannot help you." You know what you say? In the words of a successful politician, "I feel your pain. I'm on your side. I want to help you." That's a pretty good rule in American politics, and I don't think it's too simplistic to apply it to the world of foreign policy. When we deal with these countries across the world, we have to say to them, "Look, we know you want the same things we want. We want to grow up and marry the person of our choice. We want a good job. We want an education. We want good health. We want to have a family about us. We can't solve all your problems. We're not smart enough. We're not rich enough. but we want to help you. That's the way you win friends and respect, with all sorts of ways that I could suggest, but won't we have to be pragmatic about these things, but we have to let them know that America stands as a beacon of hope and opportunity in the world, and we are the most powerful nation in the world, not because of the strength of our arms or the money in our banks, but because we have served as a beacon of hope and opportunity in the world. And when this country was founded, it sparked a new era and new form of representative government and constitutional democracy. And when we opened up our doors wide to the immigrants in the 19th century, we became a destination of hope for people around the world. And when we stood up to the Soviets through the Cold War, there was little doubt to which side of the Iron Curtain most of the world wanted to live on. And our power was the power of persuasion in example. Two more points and I'll be done. American foreign policy has to rest on a strong domestic foundation. If our economic growth is robust, it encourages other nations to adopt market economies. If we are less dependent upon foreign oil and gas, we would not be so tied to events in the Middle East as we have been for decades. If we did not have a substantial deficit in trade, like we do with China and other countries, we would not be so dependent upon them to bail us out, and we would have more freedom of action in economic affairs. And if we were only more united and less polarized in this country, we'd be better able to tackle the great challenges that are before us. So you have to have a strong domestic base to conduct American foreign policy. The final point I want to make is this. I hope the next President of the United States will not be dismissive of the views of the American people. Let's not kid ourselves. There is a powerful strain of elitism in American foreign policy, a feeling by policymakers that the American people are not well informed about complex matters, that they are not able to master the subject matter, that they are guided by passion and not intellect, and that the country is better served by leaving such serious matters to the elites. If I've heard it once, I've heard it 1,000 times. Hamilton, trust me. Or, Hamilton, if you only knew the intelligence that I knew. I think we would be better off to follow the admonition of the psalmist. Put not your faith in princes. I picked up a poll the other day. What did the people want? The people, number one, wanted us to disengage from Iraq responsibly. Number two, they want us to take out, that's right, take out Osama bin Laden. Number three, they want us to engage in diplomacy, even with those people we don't like. Number four, they want America to be less dependent upon foreign oil. Number five, they want us to maintain strong alliances. And I read down through that list, and you know what I said to myself? I used an Indiana phrase. Maybe they use it in Illinois too. That was a down-home judgment. Good common sense. Look, I don't romanticize that the American people are always right. I do suggest that the policymaker sometimes needs a harness, and that we should not invariably put our trust in princes. So the next president has a formidable challenge. I have worked with a number of presidents, some in my party, the Democratic Party, some in the Republican Party. I have never, ever wanted an American president to fail. I want an American president to succeed. I hope this president will restore respect. I hope this president will see the urgent need for U.S. leadership. I hope this president will see that we need help as we tackle these problems. I hope the next president will understand that we've got to do a better job of carrying out our policy. I hope the next president will see that, sure, you've got to have a strong military, but you've got to have a strong non-military use of power, and you've got to integrate all of the tools of American power in order to have effective American foreign policy. I hope the next American president will promote our key values like freedom and justice across the world, and I hope that next president will not be dismissive of the views of the American people. We need to recognize the significant dangers in front of us and identify those challenges and seize the opportunities, magnificent opportunities that await us. Thank you very much.